an independent and a very candid voice in the government. Always a pleasure to get his views. And I don't think we could have done a more apt topic at this point in time, which is coding a new growth algorithm, reconfiguring the Indian economy. I'll request the audience to please take your seats. I hope to make this an interesting discussion. I'm presuming you'll all enjoy this, so just take your seats and keep the noise levels a little low. We'll just shortly begin. If you've taken all the pictures, can we have all of you seated? Thank you very much. So like I said, I don't think there is a more opportune time to do this session, which is reconfiguring the economy, because I think that's exactly what is happening right now. You could be a believer in this growth story, you could not, but there is a definite reshaping and reconfiguration that's certainly happening. So let's go straight into this discussion, and I think it's only fair that I begin talking to you about the global world and India amidst it all before I go across to talking about the reshaping of our own economy. The world is seeing a potential trade war in the making. Do you believe those fears are for real? Do you believe India will have to take sides on this one? We can't just be a mute spectator. We may or may not tax the Harley Davidson, but we can't be standing by and see this war unfold, can we?
Well, as far as taking sides is concerned, I'm very clear which side we are on. We are on India's side, so that we have no doubt about. But before I start, let me begin by thanking AIMA and all of you for giving me this opportunity to come and speak to you today. I can see that my co-panelist has abandoned us.
That's true.
So I am going to be thrown to the lions all on my own. So, well, I'll try and do justice to it. Now, coming to the specific question about protectionism and the emerging global scenario, let me begin by saying that let it be clear that while indeed there are all kinds of protectionist tendencies popping up around the world, we in India remain committed to a globalized system. We have, of course, been an old. We are old experimenters in import substitution. So our own history should more than adequately tell us that, if we overdo any import substitution or isolationist policies, it always ends in tears. So while it is fair that, occasionally you use some sorts of incentives maybe for to protect certain industries from dumping, or maybe even do some protection for infant industries or whatever. Different countries in the world have their own dynamics. But in general, we do need an open, globalized system. And in the end, we have to be willing to do deals with the rest of the world, and the rest of the world has to be willing to do deals with us. But yes, the old system, as it seems, may have come to its grinding halt. And by the way, let's not blame individual political leaders. Because my view is that that old system in some way has come to a creaking halt. It at multiple levels. I mean, in the US, there was been for a while now simmering discontent about Chinese imports. Now, whether that's justified or not, the fact of the matter is this has been simmering for a while. It may have reached boiling point now.
So what is the new world order? I mean, you're saying that globalization in its earlier form is not going to survive. It hasn't served the developed world, and which is why they're looking inwards. What is the new form?
See, in the end, you see, we need a set of global rules to trade. So we need to get a multilateral system of trading. And by the way, everybody intellectually agrees with this, but what has happened over time, for a variety of reasons, is that we have ended up with these complex network of trade deals. Some of them are bilateral trade deals, some of them are blocks, trading blocks. We now have a new one coming up with TPP and so on. And in fact, in the end, this is probably unworkable because it's just too complicated after a while. So in some sense, we are reaching maybe the logical end of that old path of globalization. So I am a firm believer that there will be another round of globalization, but I think those who think about the longer history of these things need to begin to go back to first principles, to rethink what this regime must be. Two, that this regime, whatever it is, must be fair to all participants, and unlike the old globalized world, must take account of the localized impacts of these things. I'm not entirely convinced that if you can have certain regime where a tiny globalized elite is the primary beneficiary of this and is willing to then consider the rest of the population as despicables.
You know, I started off this thing by saying he's candid, and it's always a pleasure to chat with him. And I'm glad you're at least bringing a fresh perspective to this debate, because everybody you speak to in the government or otherwise in industry, you're told, you know, globalization is here to last. Globalization will continue. It has benefited the world. But at least I'm glad you are taking the bull by its horns and saying it cannot continue in the present order. How should India then brace up for this new order of globalization? And what will it mean for our own economy in terms of exports? Because our export model is still very aligned with the old globalized order.
By the way, that's true for everybody. I mean,
True.
that is the order that still exists. So obviously, the systems are there. So in this context, I want to make two clear points. The first point is that we need to keep championing globalization. There is now a long debate that globalization led to inequality. But let me take that by the horns. What do you mean by inequality? In fact, while inequality may have gone up, particularly in Western countries, inside each individual country, humanity as a whole is actually more equal than it's ever been, at least since the Industrial Revolution. Because after all, China and more recently India has become richer, per capita incomes and poverty have gone up, poverty has clearly come down. So if you want to judge globalization, you must judge it not in terms of whether inequality went up or down in individual countries, but what happened between countries, with China catching up with the West and we growing much faster than the rest of the world. Inequality for the world as a whole has actually diminished because of globalization. This story of inequality rising because of the Piketty type stories is actually a very, very disingenuous one, because this is an easy thing to use to justify protectionism in rich countries and build a narrative of victimhood, which can then be used, ironically, against the poorer countries in the world, which actually need to grow faster. So I think that story has to be countered, that globalization is a good thing. Now, true, we need to take account of the localized impacts of this, and we cannot simply brush them under the carpet. And by the way, this is also true not just in the Midwest in America, this is also true here in India. So we need to take that, we need to think about transition time, we need to invest into what needs to be done in order to take along these populations along, but let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. The point is that globalization over the last half a century or so has been a good thing, and a good thing for humanity as a whole. So that's the first point. Sure. Now, come to your second point. How do we then engage with this going forward? And that actually is a very, very tricky thing. It's much trickier than people think. You asked a question that goes to the nub of something very complicated, which is this. There are extraordinary technological changes happening, whether it is artificial intelligence, or new forms of manufacturing, or all kinds of things, new energy sources and so on. And we are at the cusp at where there's going to be enormous rapid change. The problem is we have nobody on the world has any idea what this is going to lead to. And let me tell you, this is nothing new. In 1898, the world's first urban conference was held. And the main discussion in that urban conference in New York was horse manure. And everybody was discussing about how London would be under 5 feet of horse manure if nothing was done. And every discussion was all about horse manure. But within 15 years, horses just disappeared from the streets of all the major cities in the world. So let no consultant, no matter how clever the presentation, convince you that they know where this is going. We don't. The question is, how do we adjust for what is very rapidly going to happen to all of us. And how do we prepare for this? So this is a very tricky thing. And in the end, as I keep arguing, the most important thing is not our great ability to predict what the changes that will happen as a result of these technologies, which we actually have no idea about, but our ability to respond quickly to whatever happens. So it's not our ability to predict, but our ability to respond that will matter.
So it's agility more than predictability that's perhaps going to count most.
Absolutely.
But
So
Sure.
as I keep saying, the most important thing about a T-Rex is not that it was big and it had large teeth and it was scary. The most important thing about the T-Rex is that it is extinct.
Fair point. But I do want to ask you one more question on globalization before I get down and speak to you about the economy and the macros and the micros at large. You mentioned something important. You said globalization will now have to be looked at with the local impact context. Given that the kind of custom duties that have gone up here in India in the budget, and some people have kind of frowned upon this, that after espousing and embracing globalization, why are we doing this? Is this the new normal? Is this the new reality? While we will talk about a globalized world, we are going to first protect our turf, just like America is. I mean, America first is...
So let's be very clear that we have not violated any international
Yes,
obligation
we
we haven't. So be very clear, whatever we have done is well within what we are allowed to do. And of course, we are, as a country, allowed to tinker with them as we deem fit. So this should not be seen as some sort of a strategic withdrawal from globalization. This is a tactical move for a variety of reasons, not the least to help a incipient infant industry in certain pockets. So this is at best a tactical move. It is not a strategic move, and we have remained well within our rights to do it. Now, having said that, the fact of the matter is we live in a world when we adjust to it. Yes, there is a world evolving as it is evolving, and we will make sure that Indian interests, of course, while remaining within international obligations, we will make sure that Indian interests are protected.
Fair point. Let's just talk about numbers. Growth levels of 7.2, 7.5%. Till about a year and a half, 2 years back, we were the sweetest, brightest spot in the world. We were the shining armor for the global economy that was looking gloomy. And then, of course, there were decisions taken that were disruptive, whether it was demonetization or GST, some of which were warranted. Are we back to a level where the Indian economy is set for a takeoff?
Well, I hope so. Fact is that, you all know all those numbers, demographic dividend and all that kind of things. I'm not going to take you through all of that. The fact of the matter is that for a variety of reasons, 2017 was picked as the year in which to carry out a very large number of possibly painful reforms. And in some ways, demonetization shouldn't just be seen as an attempt to take out the black money in cash. Everybody knows that the cash part of black money is a very small part of the black economy. There's many other ways in which, including real estate and so on, what really the demonetization really does is a signal of a regime shift. I think that is the much more important thing to understand about demonetization. Demonetization was an attempt to clearly signal a break from the past. And so that is what demonetization is. And since then, if you see, large number of other measures were put in place which changes the framework of reference of how our social economy, the society and political economy functions. You saw, for example, the banking system being cleaned up using the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. This was a deliberate attempt to break with the old style of evergreening. And you can now see what is going on as things are getting tightened in the banking system. All kinds of fishy things are popping out. All kinds of skeletons are popping out of it. So this is just one area. What is being done, painful as it may be, is putting an end to what our ancient text called Matsya Nyaya. Matsya Nyaya is the law of the fish, where the big fish eat the smaller fish, and the smaller fish eat the even smaller fish. This was a system, a political economy, based on patronage, rent-seeking, and perpetuation of the power of a small, tiny group of people. This is now being replaced with a new India, which believes in rule of law, which believes in entrepreneurship, social mobility, risk-taking, and so on. And in order to do that, we had to create frameworks of governance. So we didn't want, so when you say less government, more governance, it doesn't mean that you simply withdraw the government and the governance happens. No, you have to impose the frameworks of governance before you withdraw the government. And what are those frameworks that are being imposed? The first and obvious one that was introduced was the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, because we went from a system where we had socialism without entry, certainly without entry, without licenses, to a system of capitalism without exit. So we have now moved to a system where market-based system where you have creative destruction and exit is allowed. So that was one major framework. The other major framework that was put in place was GST. May not have worked beautifully well in the first instance, but we have kept fixing it. It sort of works now. In another six months, it'll work reasonably well. Another big framework was this entire jam trinity thing. So what we are doing is introducing frameworks. Going forward, there are some more frameworks that need to be fixed, and I will talk to them later, but basically, this is an attempt to create frameworks so that this patronage-based system where it didn't matter what the rules said, but who you knew, is being replaced with a system where rule of law is the main driving force.
So let me ask you this question. I think your sharpest critics will give the government its due when you say we're trying to break away from what was in the past. I will not run the risk of this becoming a political debate. Thankfully, no politicians on the panel, so we'll have a saner discussion. But the reality is that, and you're right, we took some very bitter pills in 2017. It was the year of pain. When will all of those begin to show results? I'll talk about GST separately, but the cleanup act that has begun, let's just begin talking about the banks, the NPA crackdown. By when do you believe concrete results will be visible in the Indian economy?
Well, if you went back a year ago, we very well knew, even when Raghu was there, everybody knew that the banks were basically in real trouble. And we have had many episodes of cleaning up, by the way. In the 1990s also, by the way, we had a similar position. In fact, at that time, one could argue they were even worse than they are now. So this problem has perpetuated itself over time. And the solution that was being discussed maybe a year ago was, let's create a bad bank, stick all the bad loans in there, and recapitalize the banks and get them going. But what would that have done? It would have warehoused the old stuff, just like the old BIFR used to, and perpetuated them. Meanwhile, there would have been no culture change in the banks. The banks would have been recapitalized and they've gone back to doing what they were doing before. So instead, the bull was taken by its horns. We decided to use a brand new insolvency and bankruptcy code, which had never been tested, and to take the 50 largest cases, which by the way accounted for some 2/3 of the bad stuff, and to basically take them through the process. And of course, there is a process to it, which is now culminating as we speak. Many of the auctions, liquidations, resolutions, etc., will happen in the next 8 weeks, in fact. So let's see how that works out. Maybe not all of it will work out perfectly, but what will be done is at least some processes we will put in place. The old impunity is at least being challenged at some point, that there is maybe, and of course, by the way, it's not just the political system or the business class. We can clearly see major failures on the regulatory side, which are being showed up at multiple sides. So nobody is covering themselves in glory in all of this.
But you know, when you say the regulatory side, I must ask you two questions there. The whole idea is to clean up, and there are critics out there who are saying that the government is going with a very textbook sort of an approach. You know, a blanket ban on promoters, guarantors, related parties. Is that going to stall the system? We haven't really, we've not seen something like this before. Obviously, this is a new experiment that we're doing. But could the government have had a more nuanced approach than a blanket textbook sort of an approach? Because the risks that we run is the collateral damage. Bankers, off the record, tell you there could be a credit freeze altogether because we don't want to lend. You never know what we land up in.
So you're absolutely right. Well, I'll argue that it's not quite textbook, because we are in fact responding as it goes. In fact, we are criticized for changing the rules too often, in fact. But one of the reasons is we, in fact, are making a lot of major changes, And let's be very clear, we are in uncharted territories, so the best that can be done under these circumstances is to take feedback and respond, rather than take a rigid textbook approach. And is there a risk of jamming up the system with too much? Yes, there is. And as a policymaker, we have to keep our eyes open for this. So it is a tightrope where you have to impose enough order, but you don't want to do so much that you jam up the whole system, and then people who, a lot of bystanders who are perfectly good credit suddenly, find themselves becoming bad credits because you stop their oxygen. So this is a very tricky game, and bureaucracies being bureaucracies are very often not fast enough, adept enough to move with that, but that has to change. That is where political leadership comes in. And that's where basically leadership at every level, even from the regulators, has to come in. Leadership matters under these circumstances because there you have to look at what is happening and respond. And if response doesn't happen, there's no point in saying later that, operation successful but patient dead.
Absolutely. At least you're being candid enough to admit that we run the risk of an overreach, but we have to keep agile and keep responding to the situation. Let me just quote two instances, and I'm sure a lot of people in this room will identify that. The last night ban of LOUs by RBI and perhaps the scanning of 50 crore worth of NPAs, passport details. Is this the overreach risk that we run?
Well, I'm not in a position to comment on an
Sure.
RBI decision that they have just introduced. But the general point remains that you have to take a nuanced view of these things, particularly because you are not dealing with a siloed system. You are dealing with an interconnected ecosystem, and if you block off oxygen to one part, it rapidly spreads to the rest of the system. So you have to take care about these things. So while I do not wish to comment on a specific decision, this is something that policymakers have to be careful about.
But is this a time as good as any to then talk about the banking sector reforms? There is a lot of buzz, articles are written every day, we've got commentators on news channel every day come and say, privatization is the way out. Do you believe that's the remedy?
At the very least, I'm very pleased that there is a loud debate about this matter, because this state of affairs has actually festered for a very long time. The fact that this is now being brought into sunshine is in itself a good thing. There should be a debate. Let me clarify, however, that privatization is not an immediate top of the table thing that is being considered by the government. There are many things that we need to do much more immediately, including, by the way, this last part of the IBC process for the first top 12 defaulters. So that is now we are going to go through it, and we can't take our eye off the ball. But yes, there are longer term, bigger picture things that we need to think about. And I'm glad, there should be a public debate about what to do, whether it is governance, privatization too, why not? Have a debate about it. Have a debate about, what do you mean by privatization? There are many shades of such things.
But is privatization the answer to some of the ills that plague the public sector banking?
Yes and no. So that is the reason I said this is
What
not.
What is the no and what is the yes?
So this is the reason. First of all, you have to take into account that public sector banks do have a role to play in our economy. There are many things they do which a purely private sector bank would not do. So there is a case for keeping some part of the banking system public. Now, does that mean, therefore, you need 70% of the banking system in public hands? Maybe, maybe not. So this is something. So, and then, okay, then how do you go about changing that? Supposing you agree that, we need more private. There are many ways of doing that. One could be actually privatizing the banks, but the other could be just let organically the private sector banks to grow faster, the better ones to grow faster. But then you can also allow the better public sector banks to grow faster. I mean, there are some of them are not so bad. They are pretty well run and capitalized and so on. So there are many permutations and combinations of things that can be done, and all options should be taken. But the important thing here is, for the time being, while we are carrying out some very important measures, which is on this resolution and liquidation and auctioning of some very big companies, that we don't take our eyes off the ball, number one. Two, more immediate things need to be done about governance, including fixing regulatory and supervision lapses that are clearly popped up with this recent fraud case. And of course, we need to do something about the boards and human capital in many of these banks, which is something that attempts have been made in the past with the BBB, but clearly we need to do more on that.
I'll ask you a trickier question towards the end of our banking discussion, but a quick one. You know, you say very pragmatically as a policy maker that we have to be agile and we have to keep responding, and nothing can be iron cast, nothing can be cast in iron. And many people in this room and otherwise in an industry tell you that the IBC norms perhaps need a little bit of changing. The government is of the view it should be done. How soon will we see the minor tweaking that's on the cards?
Always. So the point I'm making is this is a feedback-based government. Tell us what needs to be done, but always remember, with each change, you make the system more complicated. So beware of the unintended consequences of everything that is done. In the end, this, all governance structures basically function by allowing for some give at the edges. The question is, what are the trade-offs we make? Every system will have trade-offs. What are the trade-offs we want to make? Clearly, when the law was originally made, it had certain trade-offs. Then later on, for example, in November, December, we decided, no, the trade-offs were better for the time, at this point in time, for not allow the old promoters to bid. Now, clearly, there is a cost to it because maybe it restricts the number of entries to this. But for a variety of reasons, we decided, look, if what we are attempting is a wider change in the political economy, then this is a price that is worth paying at this point in history, because we want to change the whole ecosystem itself and not allow it to be subverted by the existence of rules that may at this point be too liberal. Similarly, we'll make other changes, but at every change we have to be aware that we are making some trade-off. And if the trade-off is worthwhile for the policymakers of that time, it should be done. Nothing is cast in iron.
But as a policy maker, when you see it from the other side, the rules of the game have changed. There's no denying that. We can't play by the old rules. Those rules have changed. Is there greater acceptance? Is there greater acknowledgement, endorsement of the fact from Indian industry that the rules of the game have changed? What applied in the past cannot apply anymore. I mean, debt can no longer be treated as equity, no matter who you are.
I think the culture has changed at multiple levels. I think everybody now accepts that we are now playing by new rules. People are, of course, figuring out, including policymakers, are figuring out what the new landscape means. And I think everybody will be better off for it in the end, because it is a much more rule-based system where everybody plays by hopefully some sort of a transparent, in a transparent way, play the game. So in that sense, yes. That doesn't mean that this new setup is cast in iron, or that it doesn't need tweaking, or that indeed more changes are not needed. Some major framework changes may be needed going forward, not the least in the whole area of enforcement of contracts, dispute resolution and so on, and the whole area of legal sector that we need to have a serious debate about. By the way, it is not for nothing that the Economic Survey has a full chapter on the need for reforming the legal sector. I mean, not just the judiciary, but the whole ecosystem landscape needs to be rethought. So there are many areas that still need to be done.
How would you assuage concerns on the part of Indian industry who feel that as a part of the cleanup, there is this environment of suspicion? They are being looked at suspiciously because they are in business. There are people who voice that.
No, I wouldn't argue this. Remember, the core support base of this government comes from this from industry and business, particularly small business, and the political leadership is, I'm sure, more than aware that some pain was inflicted on it. In fact, it is quite surprising the extent to which, as a society, we have been willing to take the pain in order to move on to this new platform. And it comes very rarely in history, by the way, when as a societies are willing to take this kind of change. I mean, everybody grumbles about it, but let's give everybody some credit here in that people have been willing to take enormous changes in their stride. I mean, this is a country where, for minor things you'll have a riot and, tens of thousands of people will come and agitate, and yet everybody by and large politely queued up, grumbled a little, but politely queued up for demonetization. Everybody grumbles all the time about Aadhaar, but by and large everybody has moved on to it, and there are huge benefits from it, by the way. And by the way, just so that you know, everybody is aware that there are problems with Aadhaar. Okay, my own thumbprint doesn't work. I have to use iris scan. So there are problems with it. So it is not that it is a perfect system. But is it an improvement in the past? Yes, it is. And so, let's look at the literally tens of thousands of fake teachers have been found. I mean, some ridiculous numbers, like 80,000 fake teachers existed in the system. Railways alone had some 30,000 odd ghost employees. I mean, these are ridiculous numbers that are just eye-popping, and they were everywhere. Everybody was being affected by this. So when this cleanup happens, and by the way, this is happening at the national level, there are many things happening at the state level. Just take an example of one state, Uttar Pradesh. It imposed, strict controls on cheating. Just happened last month.
Right.
Okay, 10 lakh. That's a million students dropped out of the exam taking process. That's a ridiculous number. Now, you can argue this is a indictment of the education system, that so many kids feel that they cannot pass the exam without cheating, and that too needs to be fixed. But at least we have reimposed the sanctity of the exam system.
Fair enough, and I think nobody will doubt that. A quick question on GST before I open it to the audience. You were candid to say there have been teething troubles. It hasn't been the most ideal takeoff, and perhaps for a reform of that size and for a country like ours, it wasn't going to be. But when will the teething troubles get over? And also compliance levels being low is an area of concern for policymakers.
See, we could argue forever whether it should have been a better implementation. But let me tell you one thing. We debated for 20 years. We could have debated it for another 20 years. The only way you could introduce some major changes like this in India was to introduce it and then make changes, because there were always going to be unintended consequences, no matter how much you thought. By the way, much simpler countries with much simpler GST systems had a lot of trouble. Australia comes to mind, but almost everybody had all kinds of trouble, teething trouble, for years. So our system is not perfect. Should it have been simpler? Yes, it should have been simpler. In fact, the central government always wanted a simpler system. We just couldn't negotiate the states to come to it. By the way, now the states accept that it would have been better to do. But now we don't want to change it all over again, so we'll let it settle for a while. But believe you me, ideally, a few years from now, if you left it to me at least, I would end up with a much, much, much simpler system. I mean, don't hold me to it, but so this is my personal opinion. Ideally, what you should have a system in which essentially you should have the bulk of goods should be on one rate, say 15% or something like that. And then you have some exceptions to it, some luxury good type things at maybe 25, and maybe food type things at 5. But the average shopkeeper, without having to go through some booklet, should be able to roughly tell you which good gets taxed at which rate, just off the top of his head. That's when I know that the system works.
I wonder if the politicians will agree with you.
Actually, the politicians agree with it.
They do?
We won't get into a debate about who don't.
We will not make this political. But a quick question, before I open it to, and please identify yourselves when I do. There is this raging debate, thanks to the Nirav Modi scam, on the role of auditors and institutions and how supervision failure led to this scam. Is there a case for an overhaul completely of the way auditors work in India, the way regulatory supervision happens?
Yes, absolutely. There needs to be a debate on who is held accountable for these things. And this is true of the regulators, all the regulators, and also the various professions that are supposed to do truth-telling. CAs, auditors, company secretaries. This is why now let me take you back to demonetization, why it is important to signal regime change. Because you see, it is very difficult to move on to a new ecosystem, a new equilibrium, because the institutions of the old equilibrium very strongly suck you back.
But will you support demonetization despite the fact that a lot of money that was not expected to come back came back to the system?
No, no, no. Every good money came back. What the point about it is how much went out. So, and do you know where that money now is? Yes, you do, because it's recorded. Even if it's gone out, you know where it is. So that is the thing. But I think that is the minor part of what demonetization was about. To reduce demonetization to that is to miss the point. Demonetization is a signal of regime change. From here on, the old rules do not apply. That is being signaled. So from then on, you see IBC being imposed, GST introduced, the jam trinity really getting introduced. So this is, it's sort of like somewhat zero. From then things, so that is what demonetization really is.
Thank you very much for this enriching discussion. I don't think we really missed our panelist who actually dropped out due to bad health. I think we covered a lot of ground. Thank you for being an engaging audience. I think there are a lot of views from the government that you've heard today. There is, of course, cleanup that is required, and there will be a cost to this cleanup. And I think as an Indian, you need to brace up for that. Thanks very much.